I'm representing 2 South Florida schools today. My presentation is Linguistic Pragmatism versus Linguistic Imperialism, a case study of Ashebe and Ngugi. Some of this ground has been covered already, so I'm going to try to gloss over that so I don't bore you all to tears today. So the first thing that I'd like to do is have an activity. I teach in a community college. I have to get my students excited. It's early on a Saturday morning, so stand up, please. Up we go. There we go. All right. Thank you. Okay. So what I'd like you to do is I would like you using your first language, ideally not English. Otherwise, my activity won't work, okay? I'd like you to speak to each other and say the sentence, my favorite blank is blank, to as many people in the room as you can using your first languages. For example, my favorite color is green, my favorite car is my yellow PT Cruiser, my favorite food is chocolate, whatever. Okay, you can be as clean or as dirty as you want. Nobody's going to know, theoretically, because we're all using different languages. All right, go. Speak to each other.
Àwọ̀ tí mo fẹ́ràn jù ni àwọ̀ pupa.
Okay. Okay. My favorite color is blue.
Good. Good.
Very ordinary.
The red dish. It's rice.
I'm not supposed to use English. My favorite color is orange.
Àwọ̀ tí mo fẹ́ràn jù ni àwọ̀ pupa.
That's the same thing you said to me.
My favorite color is red.
There we go. I'm glad you're consistent.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you. Yeah, stay where you are. So now, maybe I shouldn't have told you you could be dirty, because now you're going to say the same sentence to each other in English. Oh no!
Well, you already know what I said in English.
Yeah.
My favorite color is
Let me
red.
ask you, what's his name? Is that Gabriel?
Yes, that's Gabriel. Yes, Ayola. Gabriel Ayola. Okay, so you know what I said?
Yes.
Yes.
My favorite color is orange.
Okay, ladies and gentlemen, thank you. You may take
Meine
your seats.
liebste Farbe ist rot.
Ah,
Rot, orange.
roten? In Deutsch?
Rot.
Oh, rot. Oh, rot, ja. Sprechen Sie Deutsch?
Ja.
Ah, also. Ich spreche ein bisschen Deutsch.
No, you don't get an ace only for participation, Don. I'm sorry. So, what are some of the takeaways here? For the first round, how easily did you all understand each other?
We understand.
Some of you understood each other because you're sitting in similar groups, right? But what about those of you who are in mixed groups? Did you understand? No, you're shaking your heads, right? You didn't understand each other. What happened when you all switched to English? Some with complaints, but what happened? Did you understand each other? So this is what Ashebe and Ngugi are discussing, right? You know, the idea of linguistic pragmatism, using English in order to communicate with as many people as possible, and linguistic imperialism, the idea of first using the native language because English is the language of the colonizer. So I have a brief historical context up here. I know a lot of you have spoken about the debate, but I wanted to situate the debate. Excuse me, I'm not going to read every point up here, but the global spread of English occurred over 2 diasporas, as was discussed yesterday, resulting in differing views of the language. We have countries now considered native English-speaking ones, and countries where English have become the official language. And there was the conversation yesterday about the 3 circles that this applies to as well. Bokama explained that the hegemony of the second diaspora, quote, makes English in these countries a critical language to acquire as an educated person and forces creative writers to use it to publish their African-based literary works in. This functional hegemony in African literature has generated considerable acrimony among African intellectuals since the 1960s. Today, we have at least 7,102 living languages left on Earth. English is the 3rd most spoken native language in the world. In 101 of 196 countries on Earth, English is spoken. And English has the largest number of language learners, 1.5 billion, which is about 21% of the population. When English is not only a language, but also a representation of the violent vestiges of colonialization, the issue of which language to use is compounded. For example, some African writers are faced with the choice of using an indigenous language which may meet the needs of an immediate audience, but not reach a wider global one, or using English which allows the writer to reach a wider audience while potentially alienating the very audience he or she is writing about. So that then is my thesis here, right? The debate then is, can a language be imposed upon a people adequately? Can a language imposed upon a people adequately reflect the self? Is rejection of the native language tantamount to ignoring linguistic imperialism, or do the pragmatic realities of reaching a global audience in a good enough language supersede concerns about the history of the language's spread? Two prominent African authors, Chinua Achebe and Ngugi wa Thiong'o, have taken different sides in the English language debate. Their respective positions reflect the struggle most post-colonial writers face: English as the pragmatic linguistic choice or the imperialistic linguistic code of the oppressor. They illustrate how the decision to write in English, and therefore the dichotomy between pragmatism and imperialism, is fraught with difficulty. Yet, despite its cruel colonial past, English has been necessary to both of these authors' success and their ability to reach a worldwide audience. A couple of quick definitions here. So their differing stances reflect this dichotomy. The linguistic imperialism was defined by Robert Phillipson as the spread of English for business and cultural reasons. A key aspect to linguistic imperialism is the perspective that, quote, English is universally imposed by agencies of linguistic coercion, resulting in an asymmetrical relationship between English and indigenous languages. Toby Skutna Congas, I apologize, I'm sure I'm butchering that name, coined the stronger term linguicide, which Ngugi defined in 2009 as the linguistic equivalent of genocide. He also introduced a term, lingua fam, which is to languages what famine is to the people who speak them. Linguistic deprivation, ultimately starvation. The strong negative connotation of these terms reflects the bitter feelings many Anglophone Africans have to the history of British colonization. Linguistic pragmatism, on the other hand, is the acknowledgement that using English is necessary minimally for communication. The vast global reliance on English has resulted in, quote, increasing numbers who are willing to entertain the idea that English has at least no necessary connection to any particular country or group of countries. I'm not going to get into the thorny debate of English as a neutral language today. That's not what I'm here to do. Achebe in 2009 argued, quote, the only reason these alien languages are still knocking about is that they serve an actual need, end quote. Therefore, the pragmatism of using English for many supersedes the imperialistic message that continues to resonate with using English. So we're going to look at the differing perspectives of these two gentlemen and how they demonstrate both sides of this acrimony. So we've seen the quote before by Achebe with English being able to carry the weight of his African experience. In reply, Ngugi asserted, the fact is that all of us who opted for European languages accepted that fatalistic logic of having no choice but to write in English. In response, he has attempted to shrug off that fatalistic logic by writing his creative works in Kikuyu, and then he translates his own works into English for a wider audience. In a 2004 interview with Rodriguez, Ngugi further explained, quote, the key thing for an African writer, I think, is that we have to write and we have to produce knowledge in African languages. The choice of language is what is the most important for me. Something is wrong when you have an entire intellectual elite producing knowledge in a foreign language that is not accessible to ordinary men and women. Yet, despite Ngugi's objections, English remains an official language in most colonized countries, perhaps due to linguistic pragmatism, and in the 17 countries that were colonized by the British in Africa, English is still used in all of those countries. Schneider observed that while the expectation may have been that colonized countries would abandon English as soon as possible, the opposite happened, and has been cited before. Achebe often pointed out that Nigeria has 200 languages, and so he always argued that the only way to speak to all of his Nigerian brethren was to use English. So therefore, English has acquired a particular position of importance as a lingua franca of government and higher education. As Achebe further expounded in a 1987 interview, quote, as an African and nationalist looking at the situation now, there is real value in keeping our countries together using a language that has been imposed Therefore, while acknowledging the colonial imperialistic past of English, Achebe prefers to be linguistically pragmatic and write in a language that can be understood by as many Nigerians as possible. Gugi famously defined language in 1993 as having two aspects: an agent that enables us to communicate with one another in our struggle to find the means for survival, and a carrier of the history and culture. This definition of language informs Gugi's views of English because language is integral to oneself and carries within it a legacy. The language one uses reflects the self, so African writers should write in the language that carries their people's history. Chevy, however, and other writers, including Bloch, have argued that the African writer can use English to resist linguistic imperialism. Bloch writes, this may be done by engaging in what Pennycook terms writing back, the process by which users of English around the world appropriate English and make it work for their various personal, professional, political purposes. And we had a paper about that yesterday with an argument about making English one's own. As Achebe pointed out, English can be bent to suit the many needs of the African writer, supporting a pragmatic view that acknowledges the largest worldwide audience will be reached using English, yet the indigenous nature of his text will remain in place. As he explained in an interview in 1962, we have to fashion a language that can carry the story we are about to tell. And then he talks about how he uses English to convey the reality of Igbo society and how he uses pidgin English as ways that he bends English. So Achebe bent English in this manner to great effect in his novels. Bokama pointed out that Achebe uses Africanisms and syntax and word choice as examples of his bending English. In contrast, however, Gugi strongly advocated for African authors to write in their indigenous languages. As he pointed out, colonizers brought their languages to Africa and treated the Africans as if they had no language of their own. Therefore, the African languages could not meet English as its equal. He elucidated, quote, when you choose a language, you are also choosing an audience. When I used English, I was choosing English-speaking audience, end quote. So in choosing to write in Gikuyu, quote, the emphasis will be on reaching African audiences first, end quote. However, and this was brought up yesterday, Gugi fails to acknowledge that many Africans are not literate in their native tongues. For example, in 2007, 19% of Kenyans were Gikuyu, and while Gikuyu is taught in primary schools in Gikuyu land, English and Swahili are official languages in Kenyan taught schools. So in choosing to write in his indigenous language, Gugi is not able to reach all of his Kenyan brethren, especially since illiteracy rates in Kenya are almost 50% for all languages, including English. This is not a criticism of Gugi, because the very populations being written about may not be able to read these works regardless of the language being used. When Gugi writes in Gikuyu, he is attempting to equalize his language with English and to prove, despite some difficulties, that it is up to the challenge of encompassing all topics, further removing the yoke of colonization from his people. Gugi confers prestige on his language by proving it can talk about any and all topics, and consequently illustrating that his people can understand these same topics, further proving wrong the colonizers' view of Africans as savages. Unlike Gugi, Achebe sees the issue of language as both instead of either or. Quote, the difference between Gugi and myself on the issue of indigenous or European languages for African writers is that while Gugi now believes it is either or, I have always thought it was both. And Achebe's manipulation of English is how he achieves this balance of using English to describe the African experience. Gugi wrote all of his works from 1966 to 1977 in English, and he has continued to write his nonfiction text in English. In fact, according to his son, Mukoma wa Gugi, Gugi wrote his 2016 memoir, Birth of a Dream Weaver, in English. I reached out to Mukoma, who went to undergrad with me, because when Gugi had written the statement in Decolonizing the Mind in 1986, asserting that this book was his, quote, farewell to English as a vehicle for any of his writings, end quote, I had a very difficult time finding any more information about whether or not he really did that. I mean, I knew he was still writing in English, but I didn't have a lot of evidence. He wrote in his next essay collection, Moving the Center, published in 1993, that only writing 2 of the 21 essays were originally written in Gikuyu, and he laments the difficulties of writing nonfiction in Gikuyu. Quote, there are no journals or newspapers in the language inside or outside of Kenya until, of course, he created one. So fast forward to 2017 when I was writing this paper, and I wanted to know if he was still writing in English. Most of his works lately have been nonfiction, and he is indeed writing all of those still in English. Therefore, Gugi has not forsaken English, and one may conclude his decision is pragmatic. So while Gugi has brought to light the plight of his indigenous language, spreading his message has necessitated using that very language he has so railed against. So he then practices a best of both worlds approach to language. However, Chevy's position regarding the effectiveness of writing in English wavered very little throughout his lifetime. In English and the African Writer, originally published in 1965, he concluded that for him there is no other choice. Quote, I have been given this language and I intend to use it, end quote. More than 40 years later, in The Education of a British Protected Child, published in 2009, his perspective had not changed. Quote, I write in English. English is a world language, but I do not write in English because it is a world language. I can only speak across 200 linguistic frontiers to fellow Nigerians in English, end quote. For Chevy then, English is a malleable enough tool with which he can fully illustrate the Nigerian experience and bend it to his will. His choice to use English is a pragmatic one, not an emotional one. While he reflected the African experience in his writing, he very consciously chose to write in English to be able to reach all Nigerians, all Africans, and all humans. Gugi, however, wields language as a weapon. He uses it to cut out the colonizer from parts of the African experience. He writes his creative text in Gikuyu to keep the legitimacy of African languages in the worldwide consciousness. In 1990, he demonstrated this position in the essay English, Language for the World, which he presented first in Gikuyu. Quote, a world of many languages should be like a field of flowers of different colors. There is no flower which becomes more of a flower on account of its color or its shape. All such flowers express their common floralness in their diverse colors and shapes. In the same way, our different languages can, should, and must express our common being. So we should let our languages sing of the unity of the people of the earth, of our common humanity. Just like you all today created your own field of flowers during the activity when you were speaking to each other in your first languages. So in their own way, Gugi and Achebe let language sing while confronting the thorny issues of linguistic pragmatism versus linguistic imperialism. While they may have differing points of view on when and how to use English to relate their African experiences, they have both used English to signify the importance of their experience, of their audience, and of the very language they chose to write in. Because both writers have been embraced by audiences, they have illustrated that while the decision to write in English or an indigenous tongue is not an easy one, neither approach is more or less successful than the other. And while Chevy died 4 years ago and Gugi is 80, their texts, regardless of the language first written in, will continue to educate and transform all of their